Mick Webster and Darren Hargreaves were never ordinary boys. They were rivals born into postcode loyalties in Croxteth and Norris Green. From schoolyard taunts to secret handshakes, their rivalry simmered in every corner of Liverpool. But when Mick's older brother was pushed too far and Daz's cousin saw his street shot up without mercy, the feud exploded into a war that would swallow both their lives and their neighborhoods. What started as small betrayals turned into gunshots, firebombs, and a cycle of revenge that neither Mick nor Daz could escape. In the heart of Liverpool, two neighborhoods, Croxteth and Norris Green, had long existed as quiet, working-class communities. They were places where families lived, kids played on the streets, and neighbors looked out for one another. For years, life moved at its usual pace, with little to disturb the calm. However, beneath this peaceful surface, there was an undercurrent of rivalry, small disagreements and resentments that went mostly unnoticed by outsiders. These two areas shared a common history, shaped by similar struggles and challenges, but their differences created an invisible line dividing them. Croxteth was known for its tight-knit community spirit, while Norris Green, a few miles away, had its own strong identity. Residents of both neighborhoods often spoke of our side and their side, a simple phrase that carried much weight. This kind of local pride was common, but it also planted seeds of competition and mistrust. At first, this rivalry was mostly harmless, minor disputes between young people over territory, respect, or even girlfriends. These incidents were often brushed off by the adults as typical teenage antics. But as time passed, these small confrontations started to build. A harsh word here, a shove there, and what had once been playful competition slowly turned into something more serious. What nobody fully realized was that these small cracks were forming a dangerous fault line. As local gangs began to form, they were loosely organized groups of young men who sought power and control. They used the postcode as their badge of identity. Each gang took pride in representing their neighborhood, which only deepened the divide. The quiet streets that once seemed so safe were becoming territories to defend, lines to cross at great risk. What followed was a slow but steady escalation. Incidents that might have been forgotten before became reasons for revenge. One small act of disrespect was met with another, and the cycle began to turn. The rivalry was no longer just a matter of pride. It was about survival. This was the calm before the storm, when peace was fragile, and the first drops of violence started to fall, signaling that the quiet streets of Liverpool were about to change forever. The turning point came one cold autumn evening, when a young man from Croxteth was caught stealing from a small convenience store in Norris Green. The theft was minor, a few items taken quickly and quietly, but to the people involved, it was a serious insult. In tight communities where respect and reputation mattered most, this act wasn't just about the stolen goods, it was about sending a message. The Norris Green residents saw it as a challenge, a sign that Croxteth's youth were becoming bolder and crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Word spread fast through both neighborhoods, and tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. Retaliation was swift. Within days, a car registered to a Croxteth resident was found torched in a quiet street of Norris Green. The blackened wreckage was a warning, a clear sign that this was no longer just a petty crime. The gangs were staking their claims and making sure the other side knew it. Police officers responded to the arson, but were initially unable to link it to the growing feud. At first, the attacks were seen as isolated incidents, vandalism, petty theft, small fires. But as the number of attacks increased, it became clear there was a pattern. Both gangs were no longer just groups of young men looking for trouble. They were organized, ready to defend their territories by any means necessary. The community felt the shift immediately. Families locked their doors earlier, children were told not to play outside after dark, and neighbors exchanged worried glances. The quiet streets that once felt safe were suddenly filled with fear and uncertainty. Shopkeepers boarded up windows, and rumors of more attacks spread like wildfire. Behind the scenes, the gangs grew more confident and ruthless. The stolen items and burnt cars were just the beginning. The rivalry was escalating, moving from verbal threats and minor crimes into something much darker. A war was brewing, one that would turn Liverpool's peaceful neighborhoods into battlefields. The spark had been lit, and no one could tell how far the flames would spread. As the feud escalated, violence took on a more terrifying form. Drive-by shootings. Under the cover of darkness, cars sped through the quiet residential streets of Croxteth and Norris Green, spraying bullets into houses, parked cars, and sometimes even unsuspecting bystanders. The sound of gunfire shattered the usual calm, sending waves of panic through families who had never imagined their neighborhoods would become battlegrounds. Each drive-by was carefully planned, designed to send a message as much as to cause harm. The gangs would target specific houses, tied to rival members, often hitting homes where entire families lived. Windows were shattered, walls riddled with bullets, and cars left smoking on the curb. People who had nothing to do with the feud found themselves caught in the crossfire. The violence was no longer limited to the gangs. It was spreading into the heart of the community. With every attack, the fear deepened. Parents kept children inside after dark, while older residents shuttered windows and locked doors, hoping to protect themselves from the sudden bursts of violence. Shops and local businesses experienced a sharp decline in customers, as no one wanted to risk being near the conflict. Streets that once echoed with laughter and everyday chatter now felt empty and dangerous. Police patrols increased, but their presence often seemed to make little difference. The gang members were careful, moving quickly and disappearing into alleyways or nearby houses before officers could respond. Witnesses were too scared to come forward, fearing retaliation. The community's silence allowed the violence to continue unchecked. As the drive-bys became more frequent, the scale of the conflict grew. It was no longer about small acts of defiance. This was a calculated war. The Croxteth crew and Norris Green gang members were escalating their attacks, each trying to outdo the other with bigger, deadlier strikes. The quiet streets that once symbolized home and safety had turned into front lines in a conflict neither side could stop. With every bullet fired, the cycle of revenge tightened its grip, pulling the neighborhoods deeper into darkness. What began as rivalry had exploded into a violent battle with consequences far beyond anyone's control. As the gunfire continued to echo through the streets, the gangs searched for new ways to inflict fear and damage on each other. Soon, the violence took a terrifying turn with the introduction of petrol bombs. These homemade weapons were cruel and unpredictable, capable of destroying homes and lives in seconds. Late at night, flames suddenly roared to life, engulfing cars, houses, and local businesses, turning quiet neighborhoods into scenes of chaos and destruction. The use of petrol bombs shocked the community. Unlike gunshots, which at least offered a chance to hide or escape, these firebombs spread rapidly and left little time for warning. Flames licked at walls, windows shattered under intense heat, and thick black smoke filled the air. Families were forced to flee their homes, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The damage wasn't just physical, it shattered the sense of security that had once held these neighborhoods together. Local shops, many of which were family-owned and served as the heart of the community, were prime targets. Businesses burned down overnight, wiping out livelihoods and leaving residents without essentials. The economic damage added to the growing despair, making it even harder for the community to heal. People began to question whether life would ever return to normal. The police found themselves overwhelmed. Petrol bombs were difficult to predict or prevent, and the gangs grew bolder, striking with increasing frequency. The violence wasn't random, it was part of a calculated campaign to intimidate and punish. Each attack was a statement, a violent claim over territory and respect. Neighbors who once trusted one another now eyed each other with suspicion. The flames didn't just burn buildings, they ignited fear and mistrust. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every quiet night a potential disaster waiting to happen. The community was fractured, caught in a war that was no longer just between gangs but had become a fight for survival. This new level of brutality marked a turning point. The feud was no longer a conflict between rival groups. It was a devastating war, consuming everything and everyone in its path. The quiet streets of Croxteth and Norris Green were now scorched battlegrounds. The violent cycle between Croxteth and Norris Green wasn't just a random clash. It followed a brutal and unforgiving code: revenge. Each attack demanded a response, and every injury or loss had to be repaid in kind. This code turned the feud into a never-ending spiral of violence, where no one could afford to show weakness or back down. Respect and reputation were everything, and paying back every insult and attack became a matter of survival. Families on both sides found themselves trapped in this vicious cycle. Fathers, brothers and sons became involved not just out of choice, but out of obligation. When one gang member was hurt or killed, friends and relatives felt compelled to act to keep the balance. Police launched a major operation, increasing patrols and setting up checkpoints throughout Croxteth and Norris Green. Undercover officers worked to gather information on the gang's movements and plans, trying to catch those responsible for the deadly shootout. It was a race against time to prevent more violence and protect the vulnerable. Despite the increased police presence, the community's wounds ran deep. The girl's death was a harsh reminder of the true cost of the feud. Families mourned, and many began questioning the future of their neighborhoods. The tragedy forced residents to confront the reality that the violence could no longer be ignored or tolerated. It was a turning point, a painful moment when the hope for peace became more urgent and more fragile than ever before. With the community shaken by tragedy and public pressure mounting, law enforcement stepped up their efforts to dismantle the gangs fueling the violence. Detectives went undercover, risking their lives to infiltrate the Croxteth crew and Norris Green factions. These operations were dangerous and tense. Officers had to gain the trust of gang members while hiding their true identities. One wrong move could mean exposure and violent retaliation. The undercover detectives worked quietly, gathering critical information on the gang leaders, their operations, and the plans for future attacks. They discovered a web of alliances and rivalries, revealing how the gangs communicated, supplied weapons, and coordinated their violent acts. These details were crucial in understanding the scale and organization behind the seemingly chaotic street violence. Surveillance teams tracked meetings in abandoned buildings, on street corners, and even in local pubs. Slowly, a picture emerged of the key players who were driving the feud forward. Some were young men hardened by years of conflict, while others were older figures who manipulated the younger generation from behind the scenes. The police realized the problem was deeper than just random acts of violence. It was a calculated war, with leaders on both sides unwilling to back down. However, the infiltration efforts were not without setbacks. Some officers were nearly discovered, and trust was fragile. The gangs operated with suspicion, constantly watching for informants. The stakes were high, and every bit of information gained had to be carefully weighed and verified. Despite the risks, the undercover work began to pay off, leading to arrests and seizures of weapons that temporarily slowed the violence. Behind the scenes, tensions rose within the gangs themselves. The pressure from law enforcement combined with growing fear of retribution caused cracks to appear. Some members questioned the endless cycle of revenge, while others pushed for more violence. This internal conflict hinted that change might be possible, but only if someone could break through the layers of hatred and fear. The undercover operations marked a critical phase in the feud, a shadow war fought in silence, where every secret uncovered brought the community one step closer to hope, but also one step closer to exposure and chaos. In the midst of escalating violence and deepening despair, an unexpected glimmer of hope emerged from an unlikely source. A respected elder from Croxteth, a man who had watched the neighborhood change over decades, stepped forward quietly with a bold idea: to find a way to stop the bloodshed. Known for his calm demeanor and connections in the community, he carried the weight of loss himself, having lost family members to the feud, but he refused to accept that violence was the only answer. This elder reached out to a counterpart in Norris Green, someone similarly respected and deeply affected by the ongoing conflict. Their initial contact was cautious and secretive, with both men aware that their attempt at peace would be met with skepticism or even hostility. They knew many on both sides still believed fighting was the only way to earn respect and protect their neighborhoods. Yet, driven by grief and a shared desire to end the suffering, these two men began to build a bridge where none had existed before. They arranged secret meetings in abandoned buildings and quiet corners, far from the eyes of gang members and the police. These meetings were tense but purposeful. The two men talked about the cost of the feud, the lives lost, the families broken, the community torn apart. They explored whether it was possible to break the cycle of revenge that had held Croxteth and Norris Green captive for so long. Word slowly spread among trusted members of both communities. Some embraced the idea of peace, weary of the endless violence, while others remained suspicious or openly opposed. The elder mediators faced threats and doubts, but their resolve never wavered. They understood that any lasting peace would require courage, patience, and compromise. Though fragile, their efforts laid the groundwork for a ceasefire, an uneasy truce that offered a glimpse of hope to a community desperate for change. It was the first time in years that both sides seriously considered putting down their weapons and starting to heal, but the road ahead was uncertain, and the question remained: could this fragile peace survive the deep wounds left by years of hatred and bloodshed? Just as the fragile peace seemed within reach, the deadly feud erupted once again in a shocking and brutal way. What began as quiet negotiations between the elders and trusted community members was shattered by a violent ambush that took place in broad daylight. In a busy street where families once walked freely, shots rang out without warning. The sudden burst of gunfire sent people scrambling for cover, and the peaceful hope that had been growing was quickly extinguished. The ambush was ruthless and unexpected. It caught both gangs off guard and shattered the fragile trust that had taken months build. Several lives were lost in those moments, young men from both Croxteth and Norris Green, who had just begun to question the endless cycle of violence. The attack was a harsh reminder that the feud was far from over, and that the wounds ran too deep to heal easily. In the days that followed, the streets were filled with anger and fear. The fragile truce collapsed as retaliation flared up faster and more violently than ever before. Families mourned their dead while others prepared for new attacks. The violence spread quickly, engulfing entire neighborhoods in chaos. Shops were shuttered, schools closed early, and residents barricaded themselves indoors. The dream of peace had been crushed, replaced by a brutal reality, where survival was the only goal. This final showdown was a turning point in the feud. It forced the gangs to confront the devastating consequences of their actions and the human cost of their war. Some members began to question whether the violence was worth the price. Others, fueled by grief and rage, pushed harder for revenge, deepening the divide. The aftermath revealed the true toll of the conflict: broken families, shattered homes, and a community on the brink of collapse. The tragedy forced everyone involved to face a difficult truth. The war had consumed too much and cost too many lives. It was clear that something had to change, but whether peace could ever be fully restored remained uncertain. The showdown was a dark chapter in the story of Croxteth and Norris Green, one that left scars that would take years to heal if they ever did at all. In the months following the brutal showdown, the streets of Croxteth and Norris Green began a slow, painful process of healing. The violence had left deep scars, empty homes, grieving families, and shattered communities struggling to move forward. The police intensified their efforts, making arrests and prosecuting those responsible for the worst acts of violence. These legal actions sent a strong message that the law would not tolerate the chaos anymore, but the damage had already been done. Community leaders, charities, and local organizations stepped up to help rebuild trust and offer support to those affected by the feud. Programs aimed at young people tried to provide alternatives to gang life, offering education, sports, and counseling. Efforts were made to bring together residents from both neighborhoods, encouraging dialogue and understanding to bridge the gap that years of violence had created. The memories of the feud remained fresh, a constant reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when hatred and revenge take over. Families who had lost loved ones struggled to find peace, while others lived with the fear that violence could return at any moment. The challenge was immense: how to heal wounds so deep that they seemed impossible to close. Despite the difficulties, hope began to grow. Some former gang members chose to walk away from the violence, seeking new paths and opportunities. Community leaders who had once been caught in the middle of the conflict emerged as voices for change. Their stories inspired others to believe that the cycle of revenge could be broken. The feud between Croxteth and Norris Green became a cautionary tale, a stark example of what happens when pride and rivalry escalate into deadly violence. It showed the devastating cost of revenge, not just in lives lost, but in the destruction of whole communities. Yet it also demonstrated the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the desire for peace. Though the wounds would take years to heal, the story ended with a message of hope. Liverpool's neighborhoods could rise from the ashes, stronger and united. The deadly war had left its mark, but it would not define their future. Change was possible, and for the first time in a long time, the streets began to feel like home again.